Fantasy Football. I'm your host, Jacob Stuckey. We have an action-packed filled episode today. If you guys do like today's episode, please subscribe and leave a like. That would mean a lot to me, and it really helps out the show. But yeah, we got a great episode today. We're going to be going over injury news, trade targets, and waiver wire pickups. So let's get started. Week 3 is coming up. Week 2 is pretty crazy. I feel like week 2's games were kind of a lot more kind of what I expected from the NFL games. Week 1 was very minimal in regards to scoring, and the games were just felt really weird. But week 2 was just insane. I mean, you had the Dolphins-Ravens game, where I have no idea how the Dolphins won that game, but Tua threw 6 touchdowns, and Lamar still did amazing as well. And then you had a game like the Cardinals-Raiders, where the Cardinals somehow won it in overtime. So I felt like week 2 was a lot more exciting. Although last night for Monday Night Football was a little more of a blowout than I thought it was going to be for both games. But it's still good to see that there are some really good teams in the NFL. And I think that definitely plays over to fantasy. So you want the best players on the best teams. So we're going to talk about some big injury news. Maybe your best player got hurt. Maybe you're worried about, is he going to play this next week? Is he not? Fortunately, there's not a ton of giant injury news to where a player is out for the whole year, besides Trey Lance. So Trey Lance, which is a bummer. He did break his ankle. He got surgery on it, I believe, yesterday. And so he is out for the whole year. And what's crazy is that Jimmy G, who was the starter last year, is now the starter after being the backup. So in regards to fantasy, I wouldn't really worry about it. If you have Trey Lance, you're probably not going to want to play Jimmy G. There's probably going to be better options. I would look for Carson Wentz, maybe even a Trevor Lawrence. I would probably play Trevor Lawrence over Jimmy G. But if you have more faith in the Niners offense with George Kittle hopefully coming back soon, then you're welcome to play Jimmy G. He just doesn't have a high ceiling for me. His ceiling isn't high enough. I looked at his scores from last year, and I think the highest that he got was a 30-point game, and his average was like under 20. So he doesn't have that ceiling that you're going to want for a fantasy quarterback. But for the most part, he's consistent. So if you just want like 10 to 15 points a game, then he's your guy. But that was probably the biggest news in regards to a guy being out the whole year. We had a couple other injuries where players left during the game. James Conner, he had an ankle injury. He did leave during the middle of the game. We're kind of unsure of the severity of it. The good news is that it came out and people don't think that it's a long-term injury, so that's great. We just don't know if he's going to miss week 3 yet. So stay tuned. I'll be posting updates on my Instagram if you guys want to follow me there. But yeah, as of right now, it doesn't look like it's going to be super serious, but he may still miss some time. So we'll talk about in the waiver wire segment of who you should pick up in his stead. Dalton Schultz, he left with a knee injury. This one looked really bad. People were really worried that it was going to be an MCL tear or ACL tear, but fortunately it doesn't sound like it's either of those. It sounds like it's a PCL injury. So what does that mean? It means that he may still miss some time, but thankfully I don't think it's going to be a long-term injury. But we're still kind of waiting to know more on that. Jerry Jeudy, this one was weird because he got hurt in the middle of the game and he left, and everyone was calling it a shoulder injury. It did look like he hurt his shoulder, but then afterwards the coach was calling it a rib injury. So that is good news that it's not a shoulder injury, because that would be a lot more long-term than a rib injury. He's still expected to maybe miss some time, maybe miss week 3, but maybe come back. But we're not fully sure yet. That's another one that we're going to have to wait to know more. Hunter Renfrow, he left at the last play of the game with a concussion. We're still waiting to hear if he's actually in the concussion protocol or if it was just a stinger. So, but even if he is in the concussion protocol, I expect him to make it out, kind of like T. Higgins this last week. So you should be good on there, but you may not even want to play him because his usage has been kind of concerning. So yeah, that's a little one. And then The one from Thursday night, which I thought was probably one of the bigger ones, is Justin Herbert. If you guys watch Thursday Night Football, Chargers versus Chiefs, this one was crazy because Justin Herbert was clearly in a lot of pain, and he still played through it and did his best to win the game. But they're calling it a rib cartilage fracture. This is the same injury that Alvin Kamara actually missed yesterday's game with. And so we're kind of waiting to hear more. He is having a longer break period between Thursday night and then week 3's Sunday game for him. So we're not sure if he's going to miss. I would maybe say that he misses week 3. I think that if they're smart, they'll probably want to not rush him into it. But knowing him and what we saw on Thursday, he'll probably force himself to play. So stay tuned on that one as well. We don't know enough yet on that one. A couple ones where guys didn't play yesterday. They were ruled out before the game started. Michael Pittman Jr. on the Colts. That was kind of one that was weird because he got hurt near the later half of the week. And the coach was saying, oh, he's fine. And then they ruled him out on Saturday. So they ruled him out, not even game time decision. So that was a little weird to me. The fact that they ruled him out on Saturday and it was apparently more severe than they thought. They still sound pretty optimistic though. The team does. And so I think they're thinking that he'll come back next week. But we'll kind of have to wait to see how this week turns out because he's dealing with that quad injury. Alvin Kamara, like I said, he was ruled out yesterday with that rib cartilage fracture. I kind of expect him to come back for week 3. I think he should be okay. But with that injury, I don't fully know the severity of it, and I think especially for his position, that injury is probably way worse than Justin Herbert's position in my mind, and so we'll have to see if he's able to suit up. J.K. Dobbins was pretty close to playing, and so I think he should come back week 3. Everything's kind of trending that way. He was practicing last week. I think they just don't want to rush him, but we'll kind of have to wait to see. But it does seem like he's getting closer and closer. Keenan Allen, he's dealing with a hamstring. He was ruled out Thursday night because it was such a short week. I think the hope is that he's able to return. It didn't sound super serious, but obviously a hamstring, like you don't really want to rush that because like that is an injury that does take a toll on you, especially for a wide receiver. George Kittle, Brittle Kittle, as people are calling him, which is kind of frustrating. I'm a George Kittle owner in one of my leagues, so I definitely feel the pain. But he should be able to come back week 3. Week 2, he was very close to playing, is all the reports showed. He's dealing with a groin injury. And so hope to get him back week 3. I think that would be huge. And in regards to Trey Lance not being there, does that affect George Kittle? Honestly, I kind of feel like the fact that Jimmy G's playing with him, it kind of boosts George Kittle a little bit for me. Like George Kittle played really well with Jimmy G last year. And the fact that like Jimmy G isn't a dynamic rusher, he's going to be looking for George Kittle. We saw in this last game with Jimmy that he targeted his tight ends. His first touchdown pass was to, I believe, Dewey was the tight end, backup tight end, and that was like his first touchdown pass. So if George Kittle's in there, I see them to be pretty dangerous. And so as long as they're both able to stay healthy, I see that partnership working out pretty well. Random news, which it's not an injury, but being kind of treated the same. Mike Evans was ejected in a fight in yesterday's game with Marshawn Lattimore, and he did get suspended. So he got suspended 1 game. He should miss week 3. Rumors are that he's trying to appeal it, so we'll have to kind of wait to see if he's able to somehow appeal it, but I think he'll probably be suspended. So if you have Mike Evans, you'll probably have to look elsewhere for this week. I did read that they signed Cole Beasley to the practice squad. I don't know if they're going to bump him up right away to the active roster, but maybe keep an eye on him if you're really struggling at wide receiver. But there'll be better options elsewhere, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, let's get into waiver wire targets. Now, just a note for all of these targets, these are guys that generally are all under 50% rostered. So there are some leagues where they may be a little over 50%, but all of these guys that I'm talking about, I'm talking about under 50%. These are guys that you should still be able to put a waiver wire claim in for. And so we're going to be talking about running backs. First running back I want to talk about is the running back that he should do well coming off the James Conner injury news, which is Darrell Williams. Darrell Williams and Eno Benjamin are the two running backs that will predominantly split time if James Conner does have to miss a couple games with injury. If you remember Darrell, he was with the Kansas City Chiefs, and he actually did really well last year when CEH was kind of struggling. And so I like Darrell. I think he has the higher upside than Eno. But if you pick up Darrell or Eno, you need to understand that if Conner were to miss time, that this is most likely a timeshare. And so it's hard to know, and it's hard to put a lot of fab money on that, knowing that, okay, I'm like putting fab money on a guy that's splitting time, who's not the workhorse, and where we don't even know if Conner's going to be out. So keep that in mind. But if you're able to get Darrell Williams for cheap, or maybe you're playing priority claim and you just want to put in your priority claim in there, I think that's totally fine. I think he's probably a good guy to have on your bench. I would probably rather have him than Eno, to be honest. I think he has higher upside, and I think he's just more explosive. I mean, we saw it in the game. Like, he scored a touchdown. He looked really good, and so I think Cliff, the coach of the Cardinals, I think he's going to reward Darrell if Conner were to miss time. Next guy for running back waiver wire target, which I thought was really interesting, and if I was you, I would maybe consider taking him ahead of Darrell, but I still have Darrell at 1 right now, is Raheem Mostert on the Dolphins. Now, this one was interesting because going into the season, everyone was really, really high on Chase Edmonds. Everyone was like, oh yeah, Chase Edmonds is the guy. He's a workhorse for the Dolphins. They have a really good team, obviously. That was a really good game on Sunday. But Raheem actually did really well. If we look at his stats, he scored over 10 points, 10 fantasy points in that game. He had 11 rushing attempts and 51 yards. And he did have 3 targets for 3 receptions for 28 yards. And so that's a solid stat line, to be honest, for a guy that isn't supposed to be getting the majority of the work. And so I like Raheem. I think when he was on the 49ers, he was very explosive and he had a very high ceiling. The problem is that he gets hurt all the time. He's way more brittle than Kittle. Like, he's a glass cannon for sure. But he's good. And the head coach, McDaniels, like, he obviously likes him. Former coach on the 49ers who formerly coached this guy. And so obviously he likes him enough to have him on his team and to trust him. And I think if Raheem, with the work that he did on Sunday, if that continues, I think McDaniel should continue giving him more work. Now, the same thing goes with this one, is that it is a timeshare. And so this is not guaranteed. If you were to pick up Raheem from your waiver wire, his carries and his targets is not going to be guaranteed. So that's one thing that is iffy. You're getting a guy that is splitting carries and splitting targets with another running back, and they're both good running backs. But I think I would like having Raheem on my bench, to be honest. Like, I think he would be a good flyer to take on. And he's a guy that I think I'm probably going to target for my own leagues this week, because I think he has a lot of upside. But both Darrell and Raheem, I think they both have upside. The thing with Raheem is that he's not going to need an injury to have upside. But if James Conner is healthy and he's still playing, then Darrell's value is going to be a lot less. So keep that in mind. Maybe do your own research on those two guys, but those are probably the top running back waiver targets that I would say for this week. The third one is Tyler Algier on the Falcons. This is a guy that I've kept my eye on, kind of like Zamir White. I really like him. He just needs the opportunity. And so Damian Williams was ruled out for this week. And so he did get carries. He got 10 carries and did pretty well with them. Patterson is still the main running back, and he's still the being main beneficiary from this team as far as running backs goes. But Tyler, I think, did really well. I think he's a guy that you could stash, but you would be picking him up knowing that he's probably not going to be a guy that you want to play for several weeks. But if anything were to happen to Patterson, I think he would do great, and I think he definitely would get the majority of the carries. Damian Williams, I think, got put on IR, and so he could just need a couple more weeks to prove himself, and he may get more and more carries. Because the thing with Patterson is that you can throw him in the slot, like you don't need him as a running back. So if they figure out a way to have Algier in the backfield and then Patterson in the slot, like that could work out for both players, and it could work out for both fantasy managers. So keep him in mind. You may not want to pick him up this week, but if you're playing in a deep league, I would highly suggest rostering him, having him on your bench as a handcuff. But yeah, he's an interesting guy to target. Honorable mention, this is one that I threw out last minute because I thought it was really interesting. With the 49ers, their main running back right now that they're running is Jeff Wilson. He did okay. I thought he did pretty good on Sunday in the stead of Elijah Mitchell. And then the backup, we didn't really know who the backup was going to be. And so they have a couple rookies that they're trying to figure out, okay, should this guy be the backup? And it ended up being Price, who everyone really liked coming into the NFL draft. Everyone liked him when he got drafted by the 49ers, at least from the fantasy community. I know that he had a lot of hype surrounding him. And so Price was projected to do pretty well, and he ended up being the backup, and he got some carries and looked pretty good. But then he got hurt, and I think he has a high ankle sprain. And so they announced that yesterday. So he has a high ankle sprain. He's probably going to miss 4 to 6 weeks. That's the general timeline for that injury. And so who's the next guy up? Jordan Mason is the next guy up. He's a guy that would be really interesting to pick up in really deep leagues. I know that I have him in my dynasty league that is obviously really deep because it's dynasty. And so maybe take a look at him, because if Jeff Wilson goes down, which we've seen him get hurt quite a bit, they're going to need another running back, and the next running back up is Jordan Mason. With how the 49ers play their running backs, they often just cycle them in. So if anything happens to Jeff Wilson, or if he's not producing, Kyle Shanahan has no problem going to the next hand. And that next hand is Jordan Mason. So keep an eye on him. He's probably my honorable mention. I don't know if you want to spend a lot on him right now in regards to fab money, but he's probably an interesting guy to pick up after the waivers process. Wide receivers. These ones were interesting. You got a good amount of wide receivers on the waiver wire that kind of went off, but it's going to be interesting to see if they can keep it consistent. First waiver wire target that I would be targeting is Corey Davis on the Jets. All Jets players, mainly all Jets players, had a big game on Sunday. They somehow beat the Browns, led by Joe Flacco, which is crazy to me that Flacco is still playing even though he's ancient. But Corey Davis had a good game, and I don't think enough people realized it. Garrett Wilson played great, and he deserves to be recognized from that game. But Davis had a sneaky game too. Davis had 4 targets, 2 receptions for 83 yards and 1 touchdown. So in full PPR leagues, he had over 20 points, which is really good. And so if there's a guy like that on the waiver wire and you're struggling at wide receiver, he could be an interesting play. Even in week 1, he had 10 targets, 6 receptions for 77 yards. So he had over 13 points. That's awesome. That's solid. And so he's only being rostered, at least on sleeper leagues, he's being rostered by 18% of leagues. So he's not rostered. Check your leagues. You're probably able to get him for pretty cheap. You probably don't have to put a ton of fab money on him because there probably are more attractive picks. But if I'm hurting at wide receiver, he's the first guy that I'll be looking at for sure. I mean, if you look at last year and when Corey Davis got traded from the Titans to go play for the Jets, he was traded to be the main guy for the Jets. Now, Elijah Moore turned out to be really good. Then they draft Garrett Wilson. And then they have quarterback issues with Zach Wilson being hurt. So we're going to kind of have to wait to see how that actually turns out, because they have a lot of weapons. But Corey Davis, I think, is a sneaky play. And I think he at least would be a good guy to hold on your bench, especially if you're struggling. Like if you got some wide receivers and you got some injuries, I think he could be a good guy to pack to your bench. So he would be the first guy I'm looking at. Next wide receiver is Noah Brown on the Cowboys. Now this one's interesting. I would have him as my number one if it wasn't for that Michael Gallup is coming back soon, which I think will probably take into Noah Brown's potency as a fantasy wide receiver. But his last 2 games, he's done really well. He's had 14 targets and 10 receptions in his first 2 games. First game, he had 9 targets, 5 receptions for 68 yards. That's good for over 11 fantasy points in that game. Week 2, he had 5 targets, 5 receptions, 91 yards and a touchdown. And that's good for over 20 points for that game. And that game was thrown by Cooper Rush. And I think the fact that we've seen him be effective with Dak Prescott in week 1, and then Cooper Rush went to him as well in week 2, I think that's really positive. The only thing is, are they going to need him once Gallup comes back? But I think the answer is yes. I just feel less secure about him with Gallup coming back. But I think he's still a guy that you probably want to target in your waiver wire, especially if you're struggling. I would add him. And if you're struggling, like, you can play him against the Giants for sure. I don't know if Gallup's coming back this week. I know he's getting closer and closer. We're going to kind of have to wait to see. He may come back, but just like J.K. Dobbins, they may hold him out and they may play it safe with them. So if they do that, you're going to probably want to play Noah Brown. Like, he had a really good game, especially if Dalton Schultz misses a couple weeks, which is it's expected he probably will. They're going to go to Noah Brown for sure. Like CeeDee Lamb and Noah Brown if Schultz and Gallup are out. So keep that in mind. Do what you want with that information, but I think he's definitely a sneaky pickup for sure. Third wide receiver, which probably no one is talking about, he had a really good game, was Nelson Agholor. I like Nelson Agholor. He often does this though, where he has monster games and then he's very quiet for the next couple of weeks. First week, he had 5 targets for 3 receptions for only 28 yards. He got you like 3 fantasy points. So I hope you didn't play him then. You probably didn't. Probably don't even know who he is, which is totally fine. But week 2, 6 targets, 6 receptions, over 100 yards, 110 yards, and 1 touchdown. So he had 27 fantasy points for week 2. With Mac Jones throwing you the ball. Mac Jones threw a really nice deep ball to Agholor. If you didn't see it, you should watch it, which I think is encouraging because Mac Jones, normally he's not that type of quarterback. I kind of see him as the dink and dunk kind of quarterback, that little like Phillip Rivers, Matt Ryan. Even though he's younger, he's still kind of that like soft throw to your pass catcher in the backfield, probably get you 5 to 10 yards and then keep doing that. But he had a really nice target to Agholor, and I think Agholor is a solid deep threat for this team. He's a guy that I would consider picking up and putting him on my bench. I'm probably not going to play him for a little bit. He's playing the Ravens in week 3. They are playing at home, which is good news. But in regards to playing at Foxborough, you generally don't have those giant games from receivers. I would probably feel more inclined to play like Damian Harris in week 3 against the Ravens. But Agholor, I think, is a guy you can pick up and stash on your bench. See how he does the next couple of weeks. If you're really struggling, I think he's a pretty good boom or bust option. He's got a pretty good ceiling, as we just saw in week 2, but his floor is going to be really low. A lot lower than these other 2 guys that I listed, in my opinion. But he's a guy that I would definitely keep an eye on. And if you're struggling, I would pick him up. All right, tight end options. Tight end options, a guy that you probably have heard about because he's played for a while, is Logan Thomas on the Commanders. I like Logan Thomas, but he is hurt all the time. And so when he's healthy, you pay attention because you're like, oh, I forgot about this guy. He's actually good. And he is good. He's a good player. If you're struggling at tight end, I would maybe take a look at his way. Carson Wentz is actually playing pretty well, at least in terms for fantasy. And so I would definitely take a shot on one of Carson Wentz's main options. So Logan Thomas, I think he's a good pickup. Next guy is Evan Ingram on the Jaguars. He used to be on the Giants. I think he might have been on another team in between there, but he's a good tight end. He's had a lot of potential, and he hasn't fully lived up to that potential. But I think with Trevor Lawrence, if they can get things clicking, I think Evan Ingram could be a really good option. So far, he's done pretty well. He's kind of been that kind of mid-tier tight end right now. I don't know if I necessarily think he has a high ceiling, but I think he has a solid floor, and I think we've seen that through the first 2 weeks. An interesting tight end option that you could pick up is Tyler Conklin on the Jets. I like Conklin. He was really good with the Vikings last year. The issue with him on the Jets is that they have CJ Uzomah, and so they have two tight ends that they split time between, which is fine for their team. But CJ has been hurt, and so Conklin went off. Conklin had a good game in week 2, and I think he would be an interesting guy to target. But keep an eye on that CJ Uzomah injury because we're not fully sure when he's coming back. I would probably consider streaming him until CJ Uzomah comes back. Because as soon as he comes back, I don't really want to touch him. Conklin. I don't really want to touch Conklin if there's two tight ends on there. But you never know. If you look at Hunter Henry and Jonnu Smith, Hunter Henry has done, at least last year, did really good while Jonnu Smith was still playing. So, but keep an eye on him. He's probably an interesting stream. Just a note. He is this one guy that I'm about to mention. He's a little over 50% rostered, but please check your leagues because sometimes you guys are playing in leagues where somehow these guys aren't rostered. And so I wanted to kind of mention a couple of those guys who you should definitely first check and see if these guys are available. But if they're not, then go through the targets I just mentioned. But for tight end, a guy that is a little over 50% rostered is Tyler Higbee. If Tyler Higbee is on your waiver wire and you're struggling at tight end, he should be the first guy you pick up. If you look at his first 2 games with the Rams, he has been a beast. He's been awesome. I was really surprised at his usage for week 2. Matthew Stafford went to him early and he went to him often. And I think as long as Tyler Higbee is healthy, he's going to be a beast. He's had over 19 targets in 2 games, which is a lot for a tight end. And I think he could be a solid option the rest of the year. I think he could be a guy that you just keep in your roster every week. I don't think he's not only streamable, I think he's a guy that you want on your team. And so check your leagues, and just make sure he's not there. Because if he is and you're struggling, you should get him. A guy that I forgot to mention in regards to wide receiver, which is similar, he's a little over 50% rostered, is Greg Dortch on the Cardinals. I don't know who this guy is until a couple weeks ago, but he's been awesome. He had a really good week 2, and Kyler Murray has been looking to him as kind of his second option after Marquise Brown. And so if you're struggling at wide receiver, Greg Dortch would be the first guy I would pick up. And then I would go through my waiver wire targets of Corey Davis, Noah Brown, Nelson Aguilar. But if somehow Greg Dortch isn't picked up yet in your leagues, go to him first. I think he's a guy that you possibly could play every week until DeAndre Hopkins comes back. I would probably say that. Quarterback waiver wire targets. First quarterback I would probably prioritize. So a disclaimer is if Tua is somehow not rostered in your leagues, you should probably go get him. In 6-point passing touchdown leagues with bonuses, he had over 60 points, which is insane. And he's probably a guy that you can probably start playing every week now. So if he somehow isn't rostered in your leagues, go get Tua. But other than that, my first target would probably be Jared Goff. I'm assuming last week I talked about Carson Wentz, so I'm assuming that Carson Wentz is gone in your leagues. But if Tua and Carson Wentz are available, get them first. But Jared Goff is a guy that is under 50% rostered right now, and I think he's on a solid team. It's hard calling the Lions a good team, but with how they had played the first 2 weeks, and obviously if you watch Hard Knocks, you're probably feeling a little hyped on him right now. But Jared Goff played really well week 2. I believe he had 3 touchdowns. And he looks to Amon-Ra early and often, which is crazy. Amon-Ra St. Brown had a game. I think he had almost 200 yards and he had 2 touchdowns. And he got rushing yards too, which is pretty impressive. But Jared Goff is the first guy I would go to. I think you can stream him. I would probably be a little wary depending on matchups. I think they're playing the Tennessee Titans this week in Detroit, which I don't feel great about that. Oh, they're playing the Vikings. They're playing the Minnesota Vikings in Minnesota for week 3, which you could stream Jared Goff, but you're probably going to want to look elsewhere for that. I think the Vikings are going to come out angry against the Lions, but I think that'll make it for a good game because I think the Lions have the firepower to keep up with them. And so Jared Goff, the first guy I'm looking for from the waiver wire. Second guy is Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence, I like him. I don't feel like he has a giant ceiling. And so in regards to those 2 players, Jared Goff and Trevor Lawrence, I think Jared Goff has a lower floor but a higher ceiling, which I would prioritize. But then Trevor Lawrence has a lower ceiling but a higher floor. And so Trevor Lawrence could be a safe bet. I think he's a solid quarterback. I think he's still kind of developing into the guy that he wants to be. I don't think he is comfortable making a ton of deep throws as much as Jared Goff is right now. Jared Goff is reckless, which can be good and bad. Trevor Lawrence is still mainly safe. He's kind of like that Mac Jones guy where he plays it fairly safe, but I think Trevor Lawrence is getting there. I think Christian Kirk has been playing really well. And so if Christian Kirk and Trevor Lawrence continue to connect, then I think that'll continue to pay off for Trevor Lawrence. So he's a guy that you could possibly stream, and maybe you're dealing with quarterback injuries. Maybe you have Dak Prescott or you had Trey Lance. These are the first 2 guys I would look for. The third guy is Jimmy G. Like I talked about earlier, Jimmy G is a guy that he's consistent. He gets you probably around 15 fantasy points per game, but he doesn't have that high of a ceiling, and I probably look for that to continue. But if the 49ers struggle with injuries to their running backs, then they may have Jimmy throw it more. Jimmy didn't look bad when he came back for week 2. And if George Kittle comes back for week 3, I think Jimmy's going to target him pretty early. And if the 49ers still struggle with injuries at running back, then they'll have to rely on Jimmy more. So he could be an interesting stream or at least a bench option. Maybe pick him up and stash him for a little bit. A couple honorable mention streamers. Joe Flacco. Joe Flacco had a game in week 2. I was really impressed with how he played. He's an interesting streamer. They're playing Cincinnati week 3, so it's not super desirable. If you look at the quarterbacks that played against Cincinnati for the first 2 weeks, they didn't do that good. I believe they averaged around 15 points. And Zach Wilson is coming back soon. That's the big reason why I don't have Joe Flacco on my main list, is because Zach Wilson should be coming back soon. And as soon as he comes back, Joe Flacco is going to the bench. So if you need a quarterback and all these other guys are gone, then I would play Joe Flacco, but I probably wouldn't mess with him because Zach Wilson should come back soon. If reports come out this week that Zach Wilson is struggling with his injury and that he's expected to be out longer, then pick up Joe Flacco. Go for it. They got good weapons. Joe Flacco has been looking for him. Garrett Wilson went off in week 2. I think he'd be an interesting option, but I would feel better knowing that Zach Wilson isn't coming back as soon as he's predicted to currently. And then, like I said, look for Carson Wentz and Tua. Those are the 2 guys I would look for, but they are over 50% rostered, so that's why they're not on my main list. So let's get into trade targets. This is an interesting topic for week 2 or for week 3, but after week 2, obviously it's very early in the season. It's hard to figure out if a guy is good, if a guy's bad, but we know a lot more now after 2 weeks than we did before the season and even after week 1. So this is kind of the starting point in which you're probably realizing the needs of your team, and you're probably realizing, oh, this guy's good and this guy's not so good. I should go trade for this other guy. You're kind of starting to understand who's good around the league, who are big targets that you want to look for. But I first want to talk about buy low options. Who are guys that have a lot of potential, but they haven't been playing very well the first 2 weeks, or maybe they just haven't been producing. So that's what I want to talk about first. So a buy low running back, which I really like, and I've been contemplating traded for him in my own leagues, is Travis Etienne. Now, you're probably thinking, why would you trade for Travis Etienne? He's in a split timeshare. James Robinson is proving that he's the guy. Etienne doesn't get that many points. Well, if you think about it, Travis Etienne, he was drafted very high going into this year's drafts. I think in a lot of leagues, he was probably drafted in the 3rd or 4th round. A lot of people predicted him to be the guy. Not many people expected James Robinson to come back from the Achilles injury in week 1. I think everyone kind of thought, oh, James Robinson will be back in a couple of weeks. But by then, Etienne will have the backfield. And that wasn't the case. Robinson's been playing really well. But Travis Etienne is still a big pass catcher. He gets more receptions than Robinson does. And Etienne is still getting snaps and carries. Now, he's getting out-touched by Robinson currently. During week 2, Robinson had 25 touches and Etienne had 12. So Robinson is that main guy currently. But Etienne still did okay. He had, I believe, 8 points this last week, which I know 8 points isn't a lot. But unfortunately, Etienne has gotten the same amount of points through 2 weeks that Derrick Henry has in full PPR leagues. Which is crazy to think about. Like, I'm a Derrick Henry owner in a league, so if you have Derrick Henry, I feel your pain. And as a Derrick Henry owner, I'm trying to figure out, okay, I'm still going to play Derrick Henry every week. Like, I feel dumb not. But I also got to look at other options. And I got to figure out, like, if I'm struggling on my bench with running backs, I got to find another running back to, like, bolster my running back depth. And so that's why I would trade for him, is if you're struggling with running back depth, like I am in one of my leagues, Etienne is a guy that I think you can get for cheap. I think Etienne managers, they're probably not playing him right now. They're probably not starting him. And they probably have him on their bench. And if that manager already has solid running back options, I think you can get Etienne and add him to your team to hopefully bolster your bench. I think over time, Etienne will get more work. I like the possibility and the upside with Etienne. I think he has a lot of upside. I think that if Robinson were to ever get hurt, Etienne's timeshare would be awesome. Like, he would be in the, if Robinson were to get hurt, people would be raving about Etienne. Now, I'm not saying Robinson will get hurt, but obviously we saw that he tore his Achilles, so you never know. Now, that doesn't mean that he's going to get hurt again just because he tore his Achilles. But that's a hard injury to come back from. So far, he's looked really good, which is awesome. I like Robinson. I think he's a good player. But if he were to ever get hurt again, I think Etienne would have a huge role. And even if he doesn't, I think Etienne still has a lot of upside in full PPR leagues because of his pass catching ability. And so you're probably thinking, who would I trade for him? Well, look at your team. What are your strengths? If you have a lot of good wide receivers, maybe you have some good bench wide receivers. I know in my league, I have Tyler Lockett and Jahan Dotson on my bench. And so they had really good weeks. Week 2, Jahan Dotson, I believe, had almost 20, and Tyler Lockett had over 20 points. And so those are guys that I would be willing to trade, probably just one of them, for Etienne. So you could leverage Tyler Lockett or Jahan Dotson for Travis Etienne. I think that would be a pretty fair trade. Or maybe like a Devonta Smith for him. But that's only if you have solid options at wide receiver. Like, you got to kind of understand, okay, where am I struggling? Where are my strengths? What do I need to bolster my team in regards to, if you're really struggling at running back and you stick with your 2 running backs and one of those guys gets hurt, then you're going to be in a pickle. But if you already bolster that position and you had Travis Etienne waiting, say Derrick Henry continues to not getting a ton of volume, I mean, you can have Travis Etienne waiting, and I think he would have more upside for full PPR because of his pass catching ability. So he's the first guy that I'm looking for to buy low on. And I think he's gonna start doing a lot better than he has. And so keep him in mind. Maybe message your ETN manager in your league and see what he's looking for. But he's probably not that high on him right now because he's probably not even starting him. And if he's not starting him, you can definitely get him from someone else's bench. That's kind of how I feel. The next guy that I have buy low on, but I think it's going to be more difficult, is Joe Mixon. Now, Joe Mixon, I have him as a buy low candidate. Different reasons, and he's a different kind of buy low than ETN. A buy low for ETN is probably going to mean like a Tyler Lockett or Jahan Dotson, but a buy low for Joe Mixon is going to still be a lot more than that. Just because Joe Mixon is a high caliber name. He did really well last year, which I think still carries some weight. And he had a good week 1. Week 1, he had 21 points, but week 2, he only had 11 points. And so this might be a hard one to swing, but I know that when a high profile running back, especially, doesn't perform well in a given week, that manager could be desperate. And so I have him on my list to give him a look, and maybe to give your fantasy manager that has Mixon, to give that manager that has Mixon, maybe give him a message and say, hey, how are you feeling about Mixon? Is there anything I can like help you with? Like, you kind of got to treat it like, hey, how can I help you? Like, you're selling him something, but you're also just trying to get a player from him. But maybe see like, okay, what is that manager? What are his struggles? What are his needs? I think if he's desperate, you can probably leverage a couple players for Mixon. Maybe give him a solid running back right now, and maybe give him a solid wide receiver. So that might be a hard one to swing. I definitely wouldn't buy high on him. I wouldn't trade him crazy value, but if you're able to kind of leverage a couple good options for Mixon, I would definitely go for it. I think the Bengals are going to start doing well. They've had 2 down weeks and they've lost both of their first 2 games, but I think Mixon is going to start doing really well, so I would definitely look for him. My third buy low running back is Cam Akers. I know this one's weird and you don't feel great about it, but you can probably get him pretty cheap. Cam Akers had 0 points, as we know, week 1. I talked about it. Week 2, this last Sunday, he got 8 points. And I view that as a positive. I didn't expect him to necessarily go off, but I knew that he was going to get more work week 2. The way that I see it is that if the Rams don't do well this year, if they lose games, and if Cam Akers isn't played during those games that they lose, like week 1, then people are going to be really upset at Sean McVay. Like, everyone knows that Cam Akers has way more upside than Darrell Henderson. And this is not even for fantasy purposes. Like, as a player, in my opinion, I think Cam Akers gives you the best chance to win. Now, I'm not a coach, so I understand that if you have a guy that doesn't show urgency during practice, then I get it. But from a player perspective, I think Cam Akers is going to give you a better chance to win a ball game. And so I see Cam Akers continuing to get more volume. I do see this as a split, so I wouldn't trade anything super crazy for him. I see this similar to Travis Etienne. I feel better about Travis Etienne because of his pass catching, but Cam Akers is on a better team, and I think he will probably split more work, hopefully more evenly, with Darrell Henderson. So he's kind of my third buy low. You can probably get him for pretty cheap. If that Cam Akers manager is still hanging on to how much they spent draft capital wise during draft day, then don't do it. Just back out. Like, if he's asking for someone crazy that's going off right now, don't even worry about it. But if he's like down with reality and is understanding that, okay, this is not the player that I drafted, then that's when you can definitely get him. So maybe message that manager, see what he's thinking. He's probably not very high on him. He's probably definitely not playing him. So you can probably add him to your bench to bolster your running back depth. All right, a couple of buy low wide receivers. Deontay Johnson on the Steelers. I don't love the Steelers right now, but I think Deontay Johnson has a lot of talent and ability. I think he does have a lot of upside. We haven't seen him go off yet. He's been kind of kept in a bottle so far. He's had around, I think, 10 to 12 points these first two games, each game, but we've seen him go off, and it's just a matter of time until he does. And so I would maybe look to get him this week. My issue with him is that he does have injury concern, and so I don't feel great about him week in and week out, but I think he has a lot of potential, and I think he's a guy that if you're going to buy low on him anytime during the season, it's probably now. I think his stock is just going to continue to rise after this next week, week 3. I think he's going to start doing pretty well. So if you're struggling at wide receiver and you need an elite, high caliber wide receiver, Deontay Johnson is probably going to be the guy that you can buy low on right now. And he's going to be a guy that will give you that elite league winning upside. But if that manager is asking for a lot for him, I wouldn't spend it just because of his injury history. Like if you're going to give him 2 to 3 solid players for a guy that could be out in a couple of weeks, that's dangerous. You're not going to feel good about that. But if you can buy low on him and get a good opportunity, then I would probably do it. So I know that there's a Deontay Johnson manager in my league who he's trying to leverage him in a couple of trades going on right now, but he's still kind of asking for a lot for him to where I don't feel comfortable spending that for him. But as a manager, if you have him, you're probably not going to want to sell him for low because you know the ceiling that he has. So that's kind of a tricky option, but if somehow the manager doesn't really understand that, or they don't like him that much, I would go for it. Second buy low wide receiver that I have on my list is Allen Robinson on the Rams. I like Allen Robinson. I think he's a good player, and I think he's just going to continue getting more looks and getting more targets. We saw in week 1 that he got like nothing. He got, I think, 1 catch, 2 catches, and had 3 points. But in week 2, he scored, which is awesome to see. I think the Rams are just going to continue to improve and get better. I think Allen Robinson is a guy that you can buy pretty low. I think he would be a good flex option right now. And so I would take a look at him. Maybe that manager really needs a running back, and maybe you have a lot of them. I would maybe try to find a low range running back that you can offer him. In regards to who that would be, that's kind of hard to say. Kind of depends on who that manager prefers and likes. But I would try to leverage either a solid mid-range running back for him, or maybe like a lower running back with a okay wide receiver. Like you can maybe try to do like a Nyheim Hines and like a I don't know, Hines and Lockett maybe, or Devonta Smith. Those are just kind of the guys on my mind so far. But you definitely look into your league and see who's available to you, who you have on your team, and just shoot off a couple requests and see what that manager says. My third buy low wide receiver, I just mentioned him for a different reason, but is Devonta Smith. We saw last night the Devonta Smith finally started to get more looks, and he finally started to get more receptions. I think he had around 7 to 8 targets and receptions. And so he didn't score, he didn't pass the 100-yard mark, but he was close. And that's what you want from him. Like that's what you should see from him every week, is around that kind of 15-point average. And I think he does have upside. I think eventually he will score. The Eagles have a good team, but the problem with him is that Jalen Hurts likes to run, and he runs a lot, and that team likes to run. And so he doesn't have the greatest upside in regards to getting a lot of receptions or a lot of touchdowns, because his team doesn't need him. They don't rely on him, because he's not even the first option as a wide receiver on his team. So that is an issue. But I think he still has a solid ceiling. He's still on a really good team. And if you can buy low on him to hopefully flex him on your team, or maybe you just want to add him to your wide receiver depth, I would go for it. I would definitely take a look at that. A couple of buy low tight ends if you're really struggling at tight end and you want to try to get the upside. George Kittle, he should come back soon. This guy might be hard to buy low on because, like, if you're like myself who has George Kittle as a George Kittle manager, you're not going to want to sell him low because we haven't even seen him yet. Like, we know what he can do. We know his potential. And so, but not every manager will know that. Not every manager will feel solid about Kittle. So maybe hit him up. I would, if you have Gerald Everett or Tyler Higbee, I would try to see if you can offer like a Tyler Higbee and like Tyler Lockett for him. Two guys that had really good weeks and maybe they're really struggling at wide receiver and maybe they want to play a Tyler Lockett in their flex. I think that could be interesting. Second tight end I would buy low on is TJ Hawkinson. This is a guy that you could probably get a lot lower than Kittle just because he has been playing and he has been showing that he hasn't been doing a whole lot. He's getting around 5 to 6 points per game. But I still like him. I still think he has a lot of upside, especially on this Lions team. I think he'll start doing well. I think he's a good player. Unfortunately, right now, the problem that they're running into, which they haven't run into this problem in the past couple of years, is that they actually have a lot of good talent on that Lions team. They have good players, and I think Amon-Ra St. Brown is taking a lot of those targets from Hawkinson. But I think Hawkinson is a good tight end. I think he does have a high ceiling. And so if you're struggling at tight end and you want to take a shot on Hawkinson, I would definitely go for it. I'd probably see if you can do a similar trade to Kittle. And for Kittle, you probably will have to do a little more than the trade that I listed. Like you'll probably have to do more than a Higbee and a Lockett for him. But for Hawkinson, that might be a fair deal to do a Gerald Everett and maybe even like a Jacoby Myers for TJ Hawkinson. That might not be a bad deal for the Hawkinson manager. But I definitely would take a look at that. All right, a couple of shoot your shot options. These are high caliber players that are currently struggling to where their managers might be freaking out. And this is where I would shoot your shot to see if you can sneak in on them. So Jamar Chase is the first one. This is going to be a hard one to swing just because of his caliber, but he hasn't done great in week 2. He didn't do that good in week 2. I was going to say that he hasn't done great all year, but week 1, he still performed for fantasy purposes. But the Bengals have lost both games, and it's just a matter of time until Jamar Chase blows up again. So this might be a hard one to swing, but I know that in my Dynasty League, the Jamar Chase manager, his team is struggling with injuries. Like he has a lot of injuries, and Jamar Chase is kind of his only gem right now. And so I know that if my team is doing well, I could leverage several players to the Chase manager in order to bolster the rest of their team. So for instance, the Chase manager in my league, he has Trey Lance. So Trey Lance is hurt. So I was thinking of giving him a quarterback and then also giving him a solid wide receiver still. And so, yeah, message the Chase manager league, see how he feels about it. He's probably still holding pretty tight, and that's expected, but it doesn't hurt to check. Devontae Adams is another guy. It doesn't hurt to check on him. The manager's probably holding pretty strong considering that Adams had a really good week 1. But week 2, he barely did anything. He had a touchdown, and that was about it. I think he had like 15 yards. And so that's another guy to check on, but the manager's still probably holding pretty tight. Jonathan Taylor. This one's interesting. The reason why I think that you could get Jonathan Taylor is because the Colts got shut out on Sunday, which is really unexpected. And I think the fantasy manager of Jonathan Taylor could be panicking right now because they could be saying, wait, this is not the offense that I thought they had. And so if that's true, if that manager is thinking that, if they're freaking out, hit them up and see how they're feeling. Like you could probably give them a solid running back and then a solid wide receiver to maybe see if you can leverage them. Look for the guys that are doing well right now to get some of those guys that will do well, but are currently not doing well right now. That's how I see it. Because just because you have a guy that had a really good week 2, that doesn't mean that he's going to continue that week. And we know the caliber of these players. Another guy to shoot your shot with, but you're probably going to be a little hesitant, is Derrick Henry. I still like Derrick Henry. I think you still have to play him. He's a hard guy not to play. He's going to go off eventually. And he hasn't yet. He's had 8 points for each game these first 2 weeks. And so hit up that Derrick Henry manager. See if you can somehow steal him from him. They're probably holding him pretty tight because they're disappointed in the value that he has right now. But see if you can shoot your shot with him and see if you can snatch him. So those are the main updates and the main waiver wire targets and trade targets that I have for you guys for week 3. Make sure you follow me on Instagram, Rebel FF Pod. I will be going over injury updates as well as updated waiver wire pickups and targets and trade targets. So yeah, thanks for joining me on this week's episode. Let me know in the comments if there's anything you guys would like me to cover differently. Maybe you have a question about a specific player. Feel free to comment and let me know who that player is, and I would love to give you my feedback. And make sure you subscribe and like the channel. I know it really helps me a lot, and I love to have you guys engaged and following along. So I hope you guys had a great Sunday watching football, and I hope you guys have a good week, and we will see you next week. Have a good one.